So viewing the registration list, was really excited to see how many folks were here on this call that weren't from the SPARCC family or hadn't been engaged in this conversation so far. So I want to start with a little bit of intro just about how we got here and how this body of work became a little bit of a focus for SPARCC, which really didn't happen until about the third year of our work together. So so really what we started doing is, as a lot of you know, we started engaging with partners in the 6 sites. We started looking at what was important to them and really following this path of built environment focus, of prioritizing community voice and leadership, and thinking about the role of capital and direct TA. And through some of that, there were right off the bat some CLTs that stepped up. We partnered with them doing some grant work, but more and more, the notion of community ownership was not just a transaction. It wasn't just an execution strategy. There was a lot more built in there, and a lot of folks using that term in ways that didn't mean necessarily technical ownership or legal ownership. It meant a lot of different things. And so we, in 2019, kind of started digging into this a little more. We partnered with Grounded Solutions and had folks go to their training. We're just trying to figure out how to just bring more than just sort of an execution approach. And by late last year, it was clear that this was just something that we were going to have to really sink our teeth into. And so we spent some time as staff kind of unpacking what we were hearing and what it meant and how that might be a body of work. You'll see sort of we've iterated on that throughout the course of the year, and that's part of what you'll see later today. We also were able to connect with community science, just to help us sort of bring a little bit more bandwidth to some of this and a little more expertise. And through all that, we really are trying to maintain this focus on what is it that SPARCC should be adding to the field. What should we be doing here? We won't take the place of folks like Grounded Solutions and others that have a CLT focus. And so we're really trying to stay execution focused the way we've tried to always be, and think about what's the knowledge, what are the resources that folks need to go from concept to delivery of these ideas in their community, and continue to understand this work more and more, but do it not in sort of a whole field approach, but understand it through the priorities of our partners, so that we can really be adding value to the work that they're trying to do, not just be another actor kind of floating in the system. So that's sort of our journey so far. Sandra's going to take us through a little bit of what's going on for the rest of this year and into early next, and then I'll be back up to talk more about what we learned last year.
Great, thank you, Devin. I appreciate that. So, welcome everyone to our first of what's going to be a number of webinars and other kinds of information to share about community ownership. I do want to first give some appreciation to Community Science. They are our consultant and are helping us work through some of this information. It's a lot of information to get through, and we are really just trying to make sure that what we do is provide the information that's most helpful to the sites. That's always the focus of the work that we do. So hopefully we will find that is the case. And you know what, we hadn't really planned to do this, but I think I'm going to introduce the community science folks that are actually on the Zoom. We have got Amy Minzner, and we have got Brandon Coffey and Jasmine Williams-Washington. Who did I miss? Ji?
Yep, hi, I'm here.
Hi, Ji-Wan Shu. And I think, is that everyone? Amy, did I miss anyone?
You got everyone.
Okay, good, thank you. They're an important part of this work, so I thought it would be helpful to just lift up those names so that you know who they are. I also encourage you to just check them out if you have other interest in them on their website. Just to give you sort of a preview of where we're going with this community ownership work, one of the things we're going to do today is talk about our site interviews. We have the advantage of riches, really, in the community ownership space in our sites, in our 6 sites. And so we took advantage of that and went into community science, went to each of the sites and got information from those folks that were actually working on the ground on all kinds of community ownership work. So that some of that information is going to be presented today. They also, so the interview summary that Amy will present is a compilation of those conversations. And in some cases, it's actually also information that may have been provided after the interviews. They took a lot of time and energy, as you can imagine. Scheduling interviews with folks that are incredibly busy is challenging, and so we really appreciate both the time that folks have put in on getting us this information, community science, continuing to make sure that they talk to the folks that were going to be most helpful and knowledgeable about the subject. Coming up is going to be a Community Ownership 101 library. And we hope to have that up toward the end of October. It's intended to be a resource guide that will highlight community ownership models, including CLT, co-op, and commercial ownership. It'll include topics including financing, case studies, and ownership structures. So we'll make sure that we communicate that 101 library as soon as it is available. Another thing that we're doing as part of this initiative is what we're calling a central server summary. And so sites have indicated an interest in exploring ways to create sort of a back office for the development of community ownership models. And so the intention in this would be to shorten the process for the creation of these ownership models. Toward the end of the year, November, December timeframe, we will, with the help of community science, have completed a research paper that will also be followed by a webinar. And speaking of webinars, just to talk about what's coming up, in addition to this webinar, and we're really glad that everyone is here today, we have a webinar coming up on October 8th. And that one is intended, is called Incubating Neighborhood Community Land Trusts. And the audience for that we expect to be community ownership and SPARCC sites, plus the SPARCC partners. That webinar will be the Northern California Community Land Trust, sharing how they've worked with residents and organizers to lend their real estate knowledge and CLT infrastructure to new CLTs. Speakers will include Ian Winter from Northern California Land Trust, Melissa Jones from Bar High, and Leslie Gordon from Urban Habitat. So put that on your calendars. Also coming up a week after that, on October 15th, will be LA community-owned real estate audience, which will be, LA community-owned real estate, and that audience we expect to be SPARCC sites and partners. And that webinar is SPARCC table members in LA sharing their story, the good and the bad, about their purchase of small commercial property and their shared ownership model. And the speakers there will be Tom DeSimone and Marco Covarrubias. And I'm sure that I've not pronounced his name correctly, so I apologize in advance. I do also want to just mention real briefly for those that may not be as familiar with SPARCC, that we have a lot of other work going on. We have a number of different kinds of grants that we provide to our sites to help them do their work. We have peer connections around approaches to implementation that the sites work with together. And there are also a number of other webinars that we have planned that provide information on other subjects other than just community ownership. So I think that pretty much covers it. And if I can, I'm going to toss it over to Amy, who can talk about the interviews.
Thanks, Sandra. Ella, do you want to talk about the poll?
Yeah, I was going to say, before you jump in, we have a poll in the chat that we'd love folks to fill out based on what your experience around community ownership work has been.
Ella, it's good for me to get started? Okay. So I'm very happy to be talking with you today. Sorry, I'm trying to arrange my screen so I can look at the slides and talk to you. As Sandra mentioned, we had the opportunity to interview SPARCC partners that are working toward community ownership. The purpose of these interviews was to learn about their efforts and their needs, partly to inform the proposal or the scope of our work in helping to develop some research that is going to be most useful to the partners in these cities, but then also using that information to facilitate connections and joint learning among the partners. And so on that piece of it, we've been working closely with Devin to make sure that we're synthesizing the work of the different communities so that then you can sort of know who's doing something similar and go to them for ideas or problem solving, or to sort of get jump started, understand resources, how they dealt with challenges. And so presenting this information to you all today is really a first step in that idea of helping to share ideas of who's working on what and to really kind of frame up the landscape, so to speak. I do want to absolutely say here at the start that this isn't a comprehensive description of community ownership work in these 6 cities, because we didn't talk to everybody. And we know that there's more happening in Chicago than we heard in the interviews we did, or in the Bay Area, for example. But it is a good representation of the SPARCC partners that are working on it. Yeah, so I'm going to dive right in. And one piece of methodology, as a researcher, I want to make sure everybody is sort of on the page with me, is at the end of statements I'll have numbers, and those numbers represent cities. So not partners. In LA, for example, we talked to, or we heard about 7 different CLTs. So LA is a 1, so it's sort of, we group them all together. So sometimes I'll say at least 1 CLT in a city, for example, because maybe some CLTs are experiencing something in a city and some aren't. The other piece of framing I'll share is, if you had a chance to look at the slides that Ella shared, you noticed this really beautiful mind map graphic that's going to be coming up here in a few slides that Devin's going to share. That represents the current thinking of community ownership framework for SPARCC, and that's what we're going to get to talk about in our breakout groups. So I've roughly structured my presentation along those aspects, so it'll start to sound familiar when Devin describes it. So the first part that I wanted to share with you is what we learned about why sites are pursuing community ownership. There were 2 different types of benefits: individual benefits and shared community benefits. From an individual benefits perspective, everyone talked about the importance of lowering cost of rent and home ownership, and that's kind of one of their main objectives for their community ownership work. Another, we heard from 4 cities the importance of having the residents or the businesses be able to have a share of rising asset value. And then 1 community talked about lowering energy costs and also accessing to work and recreational spaces. One thing I did want to share about methodology also is just we asked open-ended questions. So we asked people, tell us about the benefits you're working toward. We didn't give a checklist. So it may be that this represents what's kind of top of mind, people are most passionate about, the most important things they're working toward. But I'm pretty confident that, if we gave people a punch list, they would say they were doing a lot of these things. From a shared community benefits perspective, a very high priority is community preservation, whether that be retaining legacy residents, legacy businesses, and also often three partners in 3 cities said that they really were trying to develop new community assets for wealth in particular neighborhoods in their cities. 4 partners in 4 cities talked about wanting to protect or deepen a social fabric in the neighborhood. And then also 2 talked about intentionally working to preserve or increase local control over a property, over the neighborhood. One bit of context that is important is for our interviews, when we talk to community ownership, we grounded it in shared ownership of assets. We know that in SPARCC, community ownership, as Devin mentioned, can be many things. Some of it is just a spirit of community ownership. Some of it is sort of a sense of owning the trajectory of the neighborhood. But for this set of interviews, we really wanted to narrow community ownership to understand, the shared assets. So now, moving beyond the why into the how. So here is the focus. In some ways, it coincides with what we saw in the poll. So partners from 5 of the 6 cities are specifically focused, they currently have projects or are pursuing projects on single-family residential. 5 of the 6 have multifamily residential properties, and 1 of them is exploring that. Commercial property was less common. 2 of partners in 2 of the cities have active commercial property projects, and 2 are pursuing funding or implementation of those. The operating businesses, like a worker co-op, was less common. Partners in 1 city are actively pursuing setting up a worker co-op, and partners in 1 city are exploring that. There are 2 cities that have accessory dwelling unit focus for community ownership. And then in 1 city, has been developed an urban garden and a bike hub. The one thing that crosses these that we found interesting and what we were hearing was that there's sort of a bubbling up of trying to figure out how you might use single family with the community land trust and turn it into multifamily. So in some of the hottest markets, taking a single family property, dividing that potentially into 2 units and adding an ADU so that you have 1 property that becomes 3 small multifamily unit, and trying to figure out how to pursue financing and the legislative policy changes to make that feasible when you have a really hot, expensive market. The ownership structures that are the most common, everybody's using community land trusts. There is some experience and pursuing of cooperatives for housing and operating businesses. And then also a partner in 1 city is actively pursuing a REIT, a real estate investment trust, and everybody is interested in it. Trying to figure out how to make the numbers work for shared commercial ownership of property and sort of building the assets and the ownership of local residents in that process. Community representation is critical, we all know, for equity, for equitable development, for power building, for the work that SPARCC is doing. And so we tried to get a sense of where partners are on the spectrum of community engagement and involvement. The 2 themes that emerged, one is about community voice in decisions and operations. And it was kind of split. We heard that at least 1 project in 3 cities, the work is really resident driven. Residents are at the table, they are pushing for ownership, they are helping to make decisions. And in some projects in at least 3 cities, the residents are being engaged, but they aren't really involved in decision making. Sometimes it was yet, it's sort of still in development, still in figuring it out. Some of it is just hasn't quite yet been part of the model. And there were two cities where we heard directly that Black, Indigenous, people of color are in staff leadership positions or board, part of the board in the community ownership projects. So financial resources, I want to put a disclaimer here at the beginning to say we were not intentionally asking about financial resources in our interviews, but we did glean information. So we want to share that as kind of a framing of the kinds of resources, but more intentional research would have to be done to really be able to create a map of kind of the financial resources that have been used. So there are, permanent subsidies. At least one city is using all federal, state, and local governments. It seems to be most common to use maybe one or two of those, but not to be privileged to have all three where they're available. There are also, of course, philanthropic sources. There were two projects where we heard that banks, primarily through their CRA-related grants, provided the resources to purchase property that then became part of a community land trust, and also community crowdsourced funds. Capital ranging from debt, having commercial mortgage backed by rental and sales income, also through community benefits agreements that were negotiated, creating access to capital. And for operating support, having grants, but also fees. Some have been able to figure out how they can use consulting fees, development fees, ground lease fees to help with their operations. Finally, I just wanted to share briefly about the challenges, the common challenges we heard. Everybody talked about market constraints, whether the markets are heating up fast, so of course it makes the property very expensive, or that the market is moving so fast that they're not able to sort of be able to get properties before they're off the market again. There's a lot of discussion of funding challenges, but different emphases in different communities. We heard two partners in two cities talking about needing acquisition funds, partners in 3 cities talking about needing operating funds. We heard about lenders in their local community not being comfortable or willing to lend to a land trust or a tenants in common. Then there's also expertise challenges. A couple of projects talked about needing more expertise to manage a CLT. A couple of projects talking about needing more expertise to figure out how to develop it. They maybe have really sort of figured out how to structure their board and get the resident pipeline in place, but they don't know how to go out and get financing. And then there's this other piece about expertise that's really about helping residents understand community ownership and get excited about engaging in the process. The last 3 challenges we heard were about a lack of stakeholder support. So that could be that it's not a part of a local culture. There's not enough examples. It's hard to sell to your city or to your philanthropy what this might actually look like. And so then that turns into people not getting behind that. Or skepticism from philanthropy and from your public officials that this really can be a scalable solution. We heard about policy environments not being designed for community ownership. So, one city talked about really having to kind of contort themselves to be able to get their project funded through a city grant program when it really should have been a lot easier. And finally, around trust. So getting the residents to feel comfortable and trust the process, because any development is a fear of gentrification for a very good reason, or trust between city officials and residents going both ways. They're not being trust there, and then that's stalling projects. So with all of that context, I don't want to end on a down note because there really is so much positive going on and so much energy going on. But we all know how hard this work is. And so it's important to find the balance. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Devin, I believe, to introduce the framework.
And if you could go back to that last slide of yours, Amy, actually, one other comment there. I think other than being able to solve for market pressure, which is maybe a little bit out of our league, I think that that we really see SPARCC as having a toolkit and a set of a set of approaches and priorities that really address all of the rest of these, which gives us a lot of hope. It's mostly just an issue of fine tuning and finding, you know, where our role is in putting together the funding and in some cases financing, where we can supplement expertise in ways that actually make sense for the project partners and not kind of a one size fits all approach. Where we can use sort of the messaging and communication and narrative building tools that we've been working on together for the last year or so, what the policy toolkit looks like and how the collaborative infrastructure that a lot of folks on this call have been working on for years can stand in support. So I just wanted to sort of loop back there and say that it's that the challenges that we're seeing actually align pretty well with the way the initiative is designed. And so now it's about just really getting closer to the mark about what that solution set looks like. So we'll go to the next slide. So a couple of things. So all of these interviews we wrapped those all into kind of a summary of the interview notes, and those are going to be, along with a handful of other things, on our Crew platform. So those will be available, as with this slide deck and the infographic and everything for folks who want to use that. But we want to find, if there are 3 folks that were interested in a topic that was really resonating with you, you can find those other folks. We can help make those introductions, but for folks who just want to sort of thumb through the interview notes, that's all going to be available. So this beauty here started with a whole lot of Post-its on multiple walls in a conference room, you know, back when being in a conference room was a thing back in December, and we really iterated on it a lot, and it's kind of gone a lot of different directions, but it's been a way that we kind of organize for the visual folks among us, organize a lot of the content that Amy just went through. What are we hearing from sites? What do folks need? You can see we've sort of split it into sort of what are the benefits and what's the execution strategy. And community science came to our rescue and took this from sort of this illegible serpentine monster to something that I feel like is really elegant at this point and worthy of your time to walk through. And so one other thing I just want to emphasize that, you know, I think we surfaced a lot of questions through the conversations with our partners and staff mulling this over. It's certainly not exhaustive at any tier, and you know we could have continued to add tiers onto this and try to diagram all of community development. And so there's some spots where it's, you know, where we could have obviously got a lot deeper. Some things where it kind of breaks off, but it feels like kind of an organizing framework that's worthy to bring to you all now. So this diagram really, there's sort of 2 goals in creating this and spending the time to kind of firm it up. One is that it's kind of a definitional diagram and really laying out, when we talk about community ownership in SPARCC, what does that mean to all the folks that are part of SPARCC, and how do we sort of hold all these ideas together on one page? And so to the extent that there's blind spots in this diagram, we want to know that, we want to understand that. Because this is something we want to really be able to build off of and hold. The other goal is that it sort of sets up as a set of sort of exploratory questions for folks that are kind of early on in this work, and there are certainly some trade-offs within that, but I think it's kind of a topic list to go through and sort through among collaborative partners that are trying to launch these sort of initiatives or are early on in them and looking to scale up or expand. So this is the 1-page version. Folks that have incredible eyesight can read it. I could not. So I not only will I get new glasses, but I'll also sort of zoom in a little bit. So if we could go to the next slide. We sort of started, we broke these tiers out so that folks can kind of follow each of these paths separately. You know, we heard a lot about where folks are interested in sort of direct benefits to the tenants, the businesses, the folks who are using a space, using a property, and so there were a lot of those there. Some were very tangible, like rent reduction. Some of them were sort of more about access and addressing barriers and things like that. And some were things that we ultimately thought of as individual benefits, but could also be called community, things like a sense of agency and a sense of self-determination in the space that you occupy. We also recognized that there were some tension points between these, and those weren't so easy to diagram. But you know, in some of these, building wealth on the one hand is more easily achieved if you increase rents on the other. And so there are sometimes it's not as easy as a checkbox to say yes, I'll have all of the above, and sometimes there are some trade-offs, and that is particularly true in the direct benefit section. So we go to the next slide. This is the largest. It's like the community benefits of community ownership, so it makes sense that it's a full slide. And as we were breaking these apart and looking at these different sections, we really felt like one thing, we could call them shared benefits. We could also call this sort of this cultural resilience idea that all these things are about sort of preserving community. And so I won't go through all of these here. But one thing to highlight is that a lot of these are about sort of authority and control, particularly for community groups. But that sometimes there was sort of another edge of that sort of that meant taking on some risk or some responsibility or some operating cost burden, things like that. And so these benefits also sort of exist. There's another side of the balance for a lot of these. And if for folks that are tracking, you can sort of see that the little inset kind of shows you where we are on that overall map. If we go to the next slide, we'll sort of flip from the benefit side to the execution side. And we really wanted to sort of lay out the different ways that folks are approaching this work. So the asset types, certainly aren't mutually exclusive in terms of what folks are doing. The polling results today, a lot of folks were saying all of the above or interest in certainly single family and multifamily. So communities are complex, right? Obviously, it's going to be a lot of these that pop up. But we want to kind of outline those, and then particularly for vacant land, that there is this question about the public versus private path and what that means for community ownership of different kinds of resources. So we go into the next slide. The next slide, we really want to bifurcate this notion of the shared ownership, where we've really spent a lot of time this year as a SPARCC team. And it encompasses a lot of what folks were saying when they said community ownership, but there's also a lot of work that's really about direct ownership of community members. I think we actually include this, but some conversation about business owners owning their buildings. So it's really about getting assets in the hands of community members, not necessarily shared ownership structures. And from our perspective, that still has a place in what we think of as community ownership. Thank you. Reading my pauses, I love it. So governance, this one is one I think that more work can be done here, and I'm curious to see what folks think about this and how much is helpful for us to unpack here. There was certainly sort of the governance structure and the typical mechanics and things that fall into that space. There was the role of community in the operations there, and then there was really sort of that the BIPOC and racial complexity of the staff and of the board matching the community. And so these were these bigger headings, and there was, in the 1 hour interviews we didn't really get deeply into this, but there were certainly things that came up that made us want to include this section here for further consideration later. And then lastly, there was a section about the financial resources that folks are using. This could fill reams of paper. Everybody's using different sources. Everybody's cobbling together what they can. Again, it's community development. That's the way it goes. But really wanted to sort of split out these ideas of operating support in terms of what the organization needs to continue to function, where that comes from grants, where that comes from earned income and other strategies. The permanent subsidy into those deals that are, that often they're coming from a variety of sources, but that are really distinct from the repayable capital piece, and where SPARCC is spending a lot of our time trying to problem solve. So just sort of kind of splitting those out just to sort of set the frame of the conversation. So that's the monster. And what we wanted to do now was break folks into groups. We're going to break into groups generally by the experience level that folks put in the chat. And there are 3 topics that, let's see if I can actually drop these into the chat here. Yeah. And depending on the level of experience and the interest of the group, feel free to sort of chew on any of these. There'll be a facilitator and a note taker, so we'll be capturing all this to inform what will start to feel like a final version of this. But we really want to know if there are sort of big concepts and whole areas that are missing from this infographic, if there's some big blind spots that you see that we should spend some more time on. You know, there are other things that maybe that are more nuanced. It should be, since this is a kind of a definitional diagram, that we should be keying in on as SPARCC, or whether this really feels like a complete and comprehensive sort of frame for SPARCC to be diving into. And then lastly, going to this other use as sort of a set of topics to explore. Are there things that you may have wrestled with in starting an initiative or considering community ownership that isn't on this diagram and that might need to be if you're going to use the diagram in that way? So those 3 questions, they're in the chat, and I think Ella's going to wave a magic wand and going to start separate ways.
Looks like we've got everyone back. We have some possibly cute puppies also joining us.
It's either on the lap or barking. Those are the options. Are we ready? Okay, we are at time. So I do want to thank everyone for joining us. I did note to Ella, no matter how long we have for breakouts, it's never quite enough time. I hope that the conversations were meaningful, that you maybe met some new people, and that your interest in community ownership has been piqued. We are looking forward to sharing more information with you as the webinars come up. Please look out on in your email box for information on the new upcoming webinars. And want to thank again Community Science for all the work that they've done, and Devin as well for that brilliant infographic. Ella?
Yeah, and thank you again. And I just wanted to offer, as Sandra mentioned, we're going to have 2 more community ownership series in sessions in this series. So we have October 8th and October 15th. We're really going to be deep diving into some very cool models. And so I think this is a really good kind of more general piece, and we'll really be looking at, you know, the how-tos that I know some of you got into based on the chat. And we really invite you to share your feedback with us either offline, over email, chat, whatever it is. Please reach out to us so we can really co-create, co-develop. And I just want to offer that we will be following up with this recording with any of the resources that are mentioned with this infographic, so you can just marvel at it, have it framed. And then I'll wrap that up with, we really want to continue the conversation with you all, even though we know, as Sandra mentioned, there's never enough time to talk as much about community ownership as possible. So we're going to be rolling out our SPARCC crew platform, and we'd love to, we're actually going to offer you guys all, you know, free registration to go ahead and log in and then work with our community ownership group if you have more questions or want additional resources. We're going to be hosting them through that. So please let me know if you guys have questions, particularly over email. And with that, farewell.